All right, everyone, I'm going to get started. So if you came to my summit this morning after reading the title and expected to hear an educated Christian denounce liberalism and start quoting Bible verses at you, you came for the wrong reasons, but I'm glad you're here. What you're going to get is an educated Christian denounce the rampant disrespect in the journalism world and the discernment necessary to navigating waters polluted by nastiness thrown across the aisle. What you're going to hear is that it is the journalist's job to be bold in conviction and respectful in discourse. It is the journalist's job to be bold in conviction, but respectful in discourse. Now, the journalist in the free world and in free societies in general is in a unique position to explain not only the what of a story, but the why. And more often than not, because of the way that journalism has gone, more often journalists confuse their own perception of right and wrong with objective truth. And because of this, the why of a story ends up being the more important of the two. I've faced this myself, at least on a smaller scale than the journalists of the day, with my experience at the Chimes. As anyone who knows me knows, I have a very strong heart for women who have been abused. Advocacy journalism is something that I take very seriously. In addition to that, April was dubbed Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I think a couple years ago in 2015. And Biola began leading into the conversation of on-campus sexual assault when a Biola-sponsored club called Brave Voices was planted on campus in 2015. At this point, the spring of 2016, I was the Chimes Features apprentice, meaning that I was the lackey of the features editor that whole semester. And even in that position, I had the capacity to choose which articles I wanted to write on a weekly basis. And so when April rolled around, it kind of seemed like a no-brainer. I felt like the most qualified to write about this kind of story. Sexual assault happens on campus, and this is the prejudice that I came in with to find, because this is the nature I'm interested in. And at the time, this is what I expected to find on Biola's campus. This is not what I ended up finding, and it ended up hindering my ability to approach journalism in an objective way more than it helped me be a good journalist. And this is ending women to. I found out that on Christian campuses, a culture of abuse and misunderstanding of sex and a profound underestimation of the problem ended up leading to sexual assault and sexual abuse. Also, with my experience at International Christian Concern, I had the ability to explain in detail to Congress more often that internationally persecuted religions in the Middle East, namely Christians, Yazidis, and Hindus in Iraq and Syria, I didn't have to appeal to my own Christian ethics and my Christian worldview to explain why genocide was a problem. I did have the capacity to explain in Christian terms that total depravity and human fallenness were the reason behind these things. So to demonstrate this a little bit, I'm going to need a little crowd participation. So imagine we're sitting in a newsroom, I'm an editor-in-chief, and we get a call in from our friendly neighborhood public information officer. A murder has happened at a very famous law firm, known for abusing people who have come in and not paying fines their due, advantage of victims of crime. So this gets called in, and I assign somebody who wants to take this. Right, where you basically. So how would you approach this story? You find out that this is one of the founding partners was murdered, and there is this uproar, and there's suspects everywhere. Nobody knows who it might be. How would you approach this story? Who would you want to interview? That's a journalist right there. The way that I would approach this story prior to understanding journalism ethics was they got what they deserved. I'm going to write the story about the fact that these people have abused people repeatedly, and they got what they deserved. I'm going to write a story about I'm going to write a feature about all the suspects of the crime, all the people that they've abused over the years. But is that fair? No. There's a phrase that is thrown around a lot in journalism called conflict of interest. And that is the problem of journalists stepping into a story with a prejudice of saying that this is what I expect to find, even though it might not always be the case. As I mentioned with my experience at International Christian Concern, I didn't have to appeal to my Christian worldview in order to tell people that genocide is probably wrong, although in other nations and less free nations, it might not be such an assumed thing as in America. I did have the ability to speak into total depravity and human fallenness. I want to cover two recent news things that have come out and kind of discuss them with you guys about how it was handled and how it should have been handled in recent news. So the first of which was the seemingly endless string of sexual assault allegations by Harvey Weinstein by seemingly endless women. We're talking about upwards of 50 women seem to have been sexually abused by this person. So how do we handle this story? When this information gets called in, all of these people start calling in and saying, I was sexually abused by this person, and there's consistency in story, and these people have no drive and no motivation to this. A lot of them are anonymous. How do you face this story? This is one way. Harvey Weinstein definitely confirmed rapist by dozens of women. Now, any journalist, in addition to judging the fact that this is terrible formatting, will say that this headline is technically true because the blatant bias is in quotes and therefore externally sourced. Any journalist with a conscience would be able to tell you that this is anything but objective storytelling and inflammatory, to say the least. So how about this? Up to 57 women testified as sexual harassment, director responds. Not only does this assume that both sides are telling their story, but there's anonymity in saying that neither of these people are named for fear of it being wrong, for fear of these accusations being wrong. You don't want to slander someone's name just in case. Slander and libel is like the cardinal sin in the journalism world. So let's do another one. I woke up on October 1st to the notification on my phone, Las Vegas massacre, dozens killed and counting. One of the worst things that journalists can do, and anyone who knows me knows that I can rant about this for days, is inflame a situation. When something happens, you don't see the police officer running into the crowd saying, I have no idea what's going on, what should I do? Maybe run around in circles, everyone. No. Likewise, the job of the police officer is to at least pretend that they have the situation under control. Likewise, the journalist is meant to tell the what of the story before priming is an ability. Now, priming is a practice that all journalists partake in, whether or not they're aware of it. It's a process by which journalists can look at all of the facts in the world and pick them out and decide what should my constituency, what should my audience, my care about, what do we invest in. And most news outlets decided that we all should really care about the Las Vegas massacre. Priming is not a justification to cause panic, and it shouldn't be a justification to inflame a situation. It is not the job of the journalist to fabricate. It's the job of the journalist to frame. We're meant to explain, not press our prejudices or press what we believe to be the problem. So how about this? Tragedy in Las Vegas, dozens killed while attending outdoor concert. Not only does this give a lot of information about what happened, you can just read the headline and know exactly what happened, but it also primes the public into knowing that, hey, this was a tragedy. We should approach it as a tragedy. So this is not a matter of political correctness, as it often gets confused with those kind of like heavy, weighty terms. It's not a matter of political correctness. This is a matter of how people handle tragedy. There are the whats that handle tragedy, and these are the people who are going to cover the stories of the fallen. They're going to write stories and feature stories about the way the building was angled and the gun that he was using and all the people who were killed. And that's totally justified. That's a very justified way to approach journalism. The wise people, apostrophe S people, have a very righteous for explanation and understanding. Why did this happen? What kind of questions can we ask to make sure it doesn't happen again? And these are the people who start bringing up things like gun control and mental illness and society and how we as a corporate union allowed this to happen. And neither of these are wrong, but they're not telling the whole story. And the reason why they don't agree and they end up attacking each other is because they think they're not doing journalism right. So when these two sides appear and say, you're not doing this story justice, it's because neither of them are looking at journalism as a whole entity as it is. It's the what and the why. I've heard this way more often in my undergraduate education than I probably should. And my answer is the softest way that I can possibly say it, no, you probably can't. You can tweet what you yourself have just witnessed, but there is a distinct difference between the journalist and the citizen. Even recognized legally, there is a difference between the journalist and the citizen. Journalists have legal privileges that citizens can't enjoy. And because of that, you can only ever tweet what you yourself have witnessed. You can't tweet about what law enforcement says about the topic. You can speculate on what you believe to be the cause, but you can't, you as a citizen, unless you have a press pass and unless you've spoken to police officers, you can't tell the whole story. And this is why citizen journalism is a myth and crowdsourcing is not. And because of this phenomena of people misunderstanding the reason of journalism, and this is in no small part the reason of journalists, and this is the cause, Americans' trust in the media has plummeted. And you've probably seen things like this over the course of the last year with how tense things have been in our country. But I'd just like to mention that this is not only the job of the journalist, but this is the job of the citizen to start taking responsibility for understanding what you're consuming. There are two people who I really admire in this respect, and they're probably going to surprise you. Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart are people I really admire, not because of their views, and I'd like to say that up front because they are so biased, and I think that's totally fine because they're comedians. They never claim to be journalists, and if anything, Jon Stewart is more admirable in this because Colbert has thrown the title of journalist on him and he deflected it. Neither of them have claimed to be journalists because they understand the difference between the citizen and the journalist, and there is a profound difference, and that's why I admire them. The word boldness occurs 54 times in the guide text I like to call my Thomas Guide for Life. It occurs 54 times and hundreds explicitly. Most of the time in the New Testament it's mentioned in reference to the first century church. The first missionaries, the men and women in those churches, knew a thing or two about speaking truth in love and being able to prime the public into knowing what was important. I didn't come to your presentation to get a crash course on journalism. I hear that, I resonate with that. But the reason I wanted to go over these terms is because I think they're thrown around a lot and they're not defined. And in order to be bold in your convictions but respectful in discourse, you have to understand where the other side is standing before you start throwing punches. So what does this mean for the journalist stepping into the workforce? Does this mean that I can only be bold in conviction when I agree with someone, and then we can be respectful in discourse because we come from the same perspective? No. This means I have to be bold in conviction and respectful in discourse with which people I disagree. And that's what's important about what I'm trying to stress. So what about the journalist who's an aspiring lawyer like myself? Are these values only pertaining to journalism? No, I think they can be applied across all careers and across all people in the world generally. I think we all have very strong convictions about very different things. I don't think you'll find a person in the world that isn't strongly feeling about something. So it is the job of the person in interacting with everyone else to be bold in conviction but respectful in discourse, and that's what I think we've lost. So even with this ideology, I understand that my job as a journalist stepping forward is not going to be as easy as it sounds right now in ideology and in hypothetical thought. But I am pretty confident that even with this ideology in my head stepping into discourse, I'll be able to face chaos with peace, anger with respect, and be able to have boldness in respect and discourse. And I hope you guys can too. And thank you guys so much for coming. I'm willing to take some questions if any of you have any questions or feedback on anything that I've said or anything you guys came in with that I haven't addressed that you had questions about journalism. Thank you.